email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Joseph Grenny. Joseph is a 4-time New York Times bestselling author, keynote speaker, and social scientist for business performance. His works have been translated into 28 languages and are available in 36 countries. He's also the co-author of one of my favorite books, Crucial Conversations. You wrote that many of us are emotionally illiterate. What does that mean?
Well, it means that we're not conscious of how we feel and not as aware of how others feel. Our emotional vocabulary is like hungry, tired, and sad. But emotional literacy means being conscious of our own emotions and what's causing them. One of the most important skill sets that we discovered is one we call master my stories. It's learning to understand that the thought precedes the emotion, that there are stories we tell ourselves, there are stories we tell in organizations, there are stories others tell themselves that are what provoke and fuel the emotions we feel. And if we can learn to be conscious of the emotions, we can then trace back to the stories, and then we can become emotionally literate. We can become conscious of how we've gotten ourselves to the emotional place we're in, and therefore choose a different one.
So you're talking about how feelings drive actions. And when I read that, I had to think about it for a second because you made a very important point that contrary to what one might believe, it is not the actions of others that drive our emotions. So if it's not what my colleague said to me that made me angry, then what is it?
Yeah, I learned this lesson on an elevator one day. The CEO of an organization, a financial services company I was working with, had just announced a bunch of changes in the organization, including rebranding of the company. And it was, for him at least, this exciting, forward-looking direction. We were riding up the elevator 20 floors after his presentation, and he was feeling pretty full. One of the employees that had participated in that briefing was on the elevator holding a coffee cup. Now, they'd gotten these coffee cups that when you put hot liquid in them would reveal the new logo as opposed to the old logo. So it was really a cool kind of color changer thing that he was holding. And the CEO was proud of this idea and pointed at the coffee cup and said, what do you think about the coffee cup? The employee says, we're going to have a downsizing. CEO said, what do you mean? And he said, this coffee cup is smaller than the ones they gave us last year at the similar meeting. And he said, if they're going to be saving pennies on coffee by giving us smaller coffee cups, obviously the company's not doing well. Wow. And there's going to be a downsizing. How do you get there from here? But the problem is that's what we all do. It wasn't just this guy. And this guy was feeling nervous and anxious and upset. Why? Because the story he was telling himself was driving him that direction. Now, the story may or may not be true, but we all tell these stories. And we tend to tell habitual defensive kinds of stories. In the book, we describe them as victim, villain, and helpless stories. When we're in the conditions of a crucial conversation, we create predictable kinds of stories that take us to emotions that are ill-suited to dealing with an effective conversation.
Right. You said that as a follow-on to the clever story piece, you say that what we really need to do instead is recognize we're doing that and then tell a useful story. And the way we accomplish that is by telling the rest of the story, which I have to tell you, if you're of a certain age, when you hear the rest of the story, you think of Paul Harvey.
Yeah, and it's a fond memory.
It is. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you're not in my age group. So how do you tell the rest of the story? How do we take these clever stories and convert them?
Well, step one is to just admit you're telling a story. It's to admit that I don't know that there's a downsizing, but the worry and upset I'm feeling right now is because I've created a story. So the second step then is to be conscious of this. It's to verbalize the story, to put it into words. And often when we do, we start realizing that I've created a story based on a protocol that's embedded in my brain, not based on facts necessarily. But you and I tend to ask ourselves 3 questions. 1, what's the worst and most hurtful way I can take this? When people oppose us, when they have opposing opinions, when there are strong emotions and there are high stakes issues on the table, you and I tend to look for threats. The implicit question we ask ourselves is, what is the worst and most hurtful way I can take this? Second, we tend to try to tell ourselves a victim story. We want to blame others and not take responsibility for what we've done. And then we want to also make ourselves out to be helpless because helplessness means less responsibility. So what you have to do is provoke yourself in the opposite direction. You can do that with 3 really simple questions. The first is, why would a reasonable, rational, decent person be doing what that other person is doing? Second thing is, what's the right thing for me to do right now to move towards what I really want? That gets me out of helpless and into an active kind of responsible role. And the third is, what am I pretending not to know about my role? That gets me out of a victim role and it gets me into an actor role. Those three provocative questions help challenge the victim, villain, and helpless story that I told myself and help me to recognize that there's a productive step I can take, not a foolish step. This isn't about naively assuming that the whole world means us well, but just one that's not reflexively negative in a way that actually creates that response.
So going back to the topic you actually touched on earlier, I'm curious, in the current environment we're in, where I feel people are in their bunker and they're not really listening to each other, they're just hurling their own one-way communications at each other of I'm right and you're wrong. So how do we use all of this in the environment we see ourselves in today?
Well, I think the most helpful antidote to the way we tend to deal with crucial conversations is to build self-awareness. It's to start to recognize that if you aren't talking it out, you're acting it out. And if you're not engaging others and understanding their points of view, what you're doing is acting on the conclusions that you hold in a way that's creating the world that you despise. And if we could become more self-aware of the way we're contributing to the very thing we don't want, it can humble us enough, hopefully, to come back and bring the curiosity that we discussed earlier.
For me, the word mutual comes to mind listening to you talk, and you mentioned that a couple places in the book. One is mutual purpose, and that it needs to be truly mutual, and I'm highlighting the word truly here. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, what we know is that the success or failure of a crucial conversation has very little to do with how risky the issue is. And that's a really important insight for your listeners. You and I tend to think there are some really big, hairy topics and some small, easy topics. But if you think about it very long, you'll think about all of the times with a loved one, for example, at home, that you've talked about some trivial little topic and it disintegrated into a horrible conflict. And then you'll remember times when you've talked about a really big, hairy, difficult thing that ended with a feeling of intimacy and closeness at the end. And so it isn't the size of the topic that matters. What matters is how safe do people feel discussing the topic. And safety consists of two dimensions, two ingredients. The first is mutual respect. The second is mutual purpose. So I feel safe with you, Clint, in a conversation if I believe that there's a condition of mutual purpose, that you care about my interests, problems, and concerns almost as much as I do. As soon as I feel that from you, as soon as I believe that that's the case, I kind of heave a sigh of relief. And I begin to open myself to what you have to say. So it's the intent that I see in you, not the content that you're sharing. It's the intent that determines whether I'm going to be defensive or whether I'm going to be curious and open. Second, there needs to be a condition of mutual respect. So it's not just that I perceive that you care about my problems, interests, and concerns. It's that I believe you care about me, that there's some fundamental level of respect that you feel towards me as a human being, independent of whether you might not like how I'm behaving right now, but that you're willing to treat me as a human being worthy of civility and respect. And if I feel both of those things from you, then it's kind of like us going to a doctor, to a surgeon. We're willing to lay onto a table, let the surgeon take a very sharp instrument and open up our bodies if we trust them enough. Crucial conversations can feel like the same level of vulnerability. You're opening yourself up to somebody's ideas and to feedback from them, to their perspective from you. And if you feel safe with them, you'll be willing to do that. So the big promise for our listeners is that if you can learn to create that condition and manage that condition as part of the conversation, you can talk with almost anyone about almost anything.
And I think it's important because when we talk about the world that I live in doing big projects, we've always found that it's important to establish relationships on the front end. I'm fortunate to plan all the activations for a major sponsor of the Olympic Games. We start planning those projects 2 years in advance. And what we found in practice is that if we can get together for at least a few days at the front end of the project in a face-to-face environment, then the people that we don't know other than his email addresses over that week or so, we establish relationships. We foster the mutual respect that you're talking about and the project being a mutual purpose we want to be successful with. That the rest of the project, the other 22 and a half months, 23 months, can all be done remotely, but we have to establish those bonds up front.
Yeah, and my definition of those bonds, that's such a great insight, is mutual purpose and mutual respect. You're just creating that sense of comity between them, the sense that we have a common purpose and we can trust one another and that we see each other as human beings. And I mean, it takes so little sometimes to establish this. There's research that shows, for example, that the incidence of surgical errors drops significantly when people around the surgical table speak up when they see problems. No big surprise there. But the predictor of people speaking up in a surgical setting is driven significantly by whether or not the surgeon at the beginning of the surgery stops and just has everybody introduce themselves. It takes about 2 minutes.
Wow.
Just everybody becoming a human being, becoming a name with one another for about 2 minutes. And then we feel a little bit of safety, and we're a little bit more likely to point out each other's mistakes and save a patient's life.
I think another thing I read or saw that you talked about was also the please and thank you culture, which really played a role in that kind of scenario as well, right?
Yeah, what we found is in a healthcare setting that to the degree you have an environment where lag time is as close to zero as possible, if a nurse, if a housekeeper, if a doctor, if anybody sees problems, they speak up immediately and we fix what needs to be fixed. That kind of a culture is absolutely essential. It's life-saving. But the key to that culture, interestingly, is this please and thank you. It's when an individual needs to remind somebody, they use the word please, but even more significantly, if there's a power differential, if the doctor who I as a housekeeper point out didn't wash her hands before she came in to have contact with the patient, so I just reminded her to wash her hands, as soon as I issue that reminder, there's this tense emotional moment. It's fraught. And that housekeeper is watching every visual cue on the face of that doctor they can. Why? To decide whether or not I'm safe. Am I safe with this person? Does this person now mean me ill? And the best way to end that moment, the best way to offer the evidence that this is a safe moment is just for the doctor to say, thank you. That's it. Just smile and say, thank you. And now all of the emotional air goes out of the room and everything is comfortable and safe again. And so that tiny little protocol, a please and thank you culture, helps level the power differential and create a culture of candor.
That kind of ties into my next point, which is, again, as somebody who was raised to be polite, I'm constantly tempted to avoid conflict. What should we do instead?
For those who are tempted to be polite, the challenge is just to redefine polite. If polite is about fake kindness, which is really what most of us mean, I mean, it's the bless your heart culture that you described.
Right.
If that's
Yes.
the definition we've carried for our entire lives, it's time to surrender that and redefine kind. Kind is about people's long-term interests. It's about helping them achieve results. It's about helping them in their lives. And sometimes that involves a little bit of discomfort. And so two of the phrases that we've encouraged in these healthcare environments are, number one, it's kind to remind. And number two, show gratitude, not attitude.
Right.
When somebody reminds you, respond to that by acknowledging this is the ultimate kindness that they just offered me. I'm not the kind of person that wants to harm a patient, and you just help me not be that kind of person. And so if we redefine what a crucial conversation is about, that this really is the most profound expression of vulnerability and of compassion, then I think it makes it easier for us to step into those moments.
Another point you made in the book, which I feel personally is a really important distinction, is that to understand another's point of view does not necessarily mean we agree with it or support it. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, exactly. So as I described earlier, if you bring curiosity to a conversation, I think you end up understanding how their world works. So I had a situation 12 years ago or so when the U.S. had taken a significant foreign policy move and had invaded another country. This was Iraq at the time. And I was in London. I arrived about 3 o'clock in the morning, got into one of those beautiful cabs that they've got, and I was headed towards my hotel, exhausted at 2 o'clock in the morning. And the cabbie looked back and said, "Are you an American?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Your president is a murderer." And I said, "You're not really worried about a tip today, are you?" trying to make light of the moment. But he just set in on me. And as soon as he set in on me, now he didn't even know what my point of view was about our particular military action at that point. But I stopped him for a second. I said, "You know what?" I said, "We had about a 45-minute ride from the airport to my hotel." And I said, "And I'd be interested in your point of view, but I want a rule in place." And he looked at me kind of funny. And I said, "Here's the rule." I said, "You get 5 minutes to say anything to me you want. And I want to be able to ask you all the questions that I want to ask you about what you think about where the U.S. is right now on this issue." And I said, "But then I want 5 minutes too. And I want you to listen to me." And I said, "Are you willing to do that?" And he took a deep breath, had to think about it for a minute because he really wanted to deliver a monologue, not have a dialogue to start with. But he ponied up to it and he said, "Yeah, that's what I want." We had a wonderful conversation. We had an absolutely wonderful conversation. And why? Because the ground rule was curiosity. It wasn't agreement. So we could get to my hotel, and at the end, he could still think that George Bush is a murderer. And I could still think whatever I thought prior to coming into this conversation. but at least the two of us would have the benefit of understanding a different point of view. And I will tell you, 5 minutes into his conversation, I thought, wow, I get it. I get this. I had a reverence for his perspective that I hadn't had when I got in the cab.
Wow, that's a great story, Joseph. Thanks for sharing that. As we kind of close things out, I was just curious. You and I chatted before the call officially started, and we talked about project management and some research you've done. Is there any one or two things about project management, and I realize I'm putting you on the spot, is there any one or two things you've seen about how crucial conversations impact teamwork or project work?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's a study that we have at our website. I can give you that web link if you want to attach
Please.
it for your
Yeah.
listeners as well. With this project management study, what we found is that there are 5 basic crucial kinds of moments that happen in the life of a project. And those are the make or break. They were remarkably predictive of how the project would come out. So it wasn't just about, do you have the right funding and the right team? It's about these moments. And I'll just share a couple of them. So one of them was when a senior sponsor goes AWOL, when they stop providing the leadership and the support that they were supposed to offer. And in most projects, rather than talking that out and holding that person accountable, we act it out. Second is when there are team issues, when somebody stops showing up, stops getting their piece done, and they don't hardline report into the project manager. And so the project manager starts to feel powerless. And how do I hold this person accountable? Those moments become crucial moments as well. So there are 5 of these kinds of moments. And the issue is not the moments. The issue is whether we speak up with candor and safety. So it's holding an effective, crucial conversation in those moments. And our research showed very clearly that if you develop this skill set, that the likelihood of a successful, on time, on budget, on spec outcome goes up enormously. So it's as relevant as it is to any context.
Yeah, I think from my perspective as well, one of the most powerful words you can have in project work is the word no. And going back to being kind instead of candid, as human beings, we want to please. And so we have a tendency to say yes to everything. And in reality, we should be saying no to a lot of things, because we know we're not going to be successful in the end anyway. So let's just address the 800-pound gorilla in the room head on and be honest. This is a bad project and we shouldn't take it on. But we tend to steer away from those crucial conversations at the worst possible time.
That is so true in projects. That's so true in executive teams. That's so true at home in our relationships. The capacity to set boundaries, to be honest about what's real for me, is the precondition of any kind of real and authentic relationship.
Well, this has been awesome, Joseph. Thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed talking with you about crucial conversations in relationships and business and personal life. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, how can they do that?
So our company website is Vital Smarts, VITAL, smarts with an S on the end.com. They can also go to crucialconversations.com, and there's an enormous number of resources, including some of the studies that we've referenced and a variety of other industry studies as well.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, Joseph. Thanks for the conversation.
Likewise, wonderful to be part of your conversation here, Clint.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at Amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.